Hello, all. Welcome to the Maximl podcast. I'm your host, Shomak Roy. And on this podcast, we bring in experts from around the world, experts on maintenance and reliability and plant turnarounds. And today, we are very fortunate to have two people who have been in the industry for a while and have spent many years thinking about the problems we encounter every day at refineries. We have Frank, a veteran turnaround specialist and a person who wears many hats. And we have Pankaj, founder CEO of Maximum. Frank, please can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Oh, it's Frank Engli. I'm basically a consultant in the maintenance turnaround areas, helping clients throughout the industry in North America and some overseas, improving their competitiveness and efficiency in terms of maintaining reliability and operability. I'm based in Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada.
Fantastic, Frank. Thank you. How about you, Pankaj?
Thanks, Amak. Hi, Frank. Nice to be here. Hi, I'm Pankaj, the founder and CEO of Maximl. We are creating an industrial AI platform for turnarounds and safety, focusing on maintenance and permits. Super excited to be here and having this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you for this opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you for being with us today, Frank and Pankaj. So, Frank, these times are not normal. We don't live in. I know the word unprecedented is a bit abused, but it's literally true in May of 2026. We are seeing an energy supply shock, the kind of which we have never seen before. How do you think that this impacts? How do refineries plan? How does the downstream industry plan under these circumstances? How would they plan their maintenance and reliability roadmap, their turnaround roadmaps?
Yeah, it's a big challenge because for those who do have a steady supply of crude, and the margins are so high, it's now finding the opportunity to continue operations and maybe postponing some critical work or their planned outages or planned maintenance to take advantage of the high market situations. And so that's a big challenge out there. On the other hand, if you're in a situation where you can't get supply, then you're struggling to meet your market needs. But at the same time, I know some folks are considering maybe now's the time to take that outage and do the maintenance because they're running at half rates or whatever their situation calls for. So it really depends on where your location is, what the current market situation is for yourselves, and what is the best means of managing that.
Right.
And
those who sorry, please go on, Pankaj.
No, sorry, so Frank, I think on the first dimension, when people have that supply of crude and they had scheduled projects, turnarounds and everything, right? And I was speaking to a large company out in Southeast Asia, and there the CXOs are just hearing money, right? Because of the high margins. So you can't really stop it, right? So I think, and the team, the maintenance and the reliability teams, they were having a hard time digesting the risk that is accumulating because, everything is kind of getting deferred, right? So I think it's interesting, Frank, like how do you kind of perceive that? How do we kind of find that balance? And more importantly, Frank, I think that teams wanted to know how do we communicate this to the CXOs to find that balance, or how should they kind of
it really depends on the
how should they kind
of it really depends on the situation you're at, because depending on what your past history is with organizations, you may have the ability, because if you've been on a time-based system and you're moving towards a risk-based inspection process, you may find those opportunities to extend the run length, or at least maybe reduce the outage duration and just do what is critical, and then postpone other items to basically be able to do them either online at a lower cost, or just basically let it extend the run. One of the things is that what you want to do is you want to maximize the interval between your outages to amortize the cost of the outage and reduce your annualized costs is clear. I would just reflect back on, if you remember the COVID era, a lot of people were very comfortable in what they did. And I think, and a lot of people, a lot of sites applied new thoughts, took different approaches, and were able to manage through COVID. Some people learned their lessons and applied it on a continuous basis. Others fell back. So I would look back at that period and sit back and say, okay, what were those lessons learned that we could potentially apply here and maintain the reliability and the reduced cost so that we do operate. And I think the other one is when put under stressful situations, we become creative. And maybe those traditional ways of going about doing things, having planned large outages, it may be, depending on your situation, there may be market conditions where you could take a minor outage and do most of the work without affecting your product production and still get the necessary reliability that you need to maintain your operating condition.
Right. Makes sense. I think, Frank, so there is just, I'm as I'm remembering that conversation that I had with the teams, right? So while there is this turbulence due to the Middle East scenario, I think other dimension is basically, I think, Frank, where there are certain regulatory changes in certain geographies, where, for example, I think in Southeast Asia, the regulators are kind of changing the high pressure equipment inspection, and which was earlier kind of external linked. The factory inspectors would come and basically kind of do those like 3 to 5 years, particularly, let's say, for example, boilers. I think I'm also hearing things like they are trying to basically then push that back onto the client that, hey, you need to kind of self-certify it, and instead of like an external dependency. And what that is creating a chaos or a risk appetite, because again CXOs will basically push, hey, you can run for 7 years, right? But the internal teams now, they're not really equipped to sign off on that, right?
I guess it really comes down to comfort zone. And the analogy I would use is that people are operating safely with extended run lengths using risk-based inspection versus time-based inspection strategies. And the issue is that, yes, it's a change, and change is hard to manage. But if others are able to do it, you're entitled to do it. It's the same analogy I would use as, changing the tire on your car. Takes you 20 minutes to change a tire, but technically you're entitled for 2 seconds like they do in Formula One. It's just, are you willing to pay for it? And so it really comes down to is understanding if others can do it. And many a times organizations view that, they'll sit there and say, well, we can't do it. I would challenge them and say, okay, if you can't do it, what can we do? And again, it's a journey to get to competitive status and transition into new ways. But other organizations across the world are doing it. And, they're basically finding ways to extend their run lengths and basically spread the cost of the annual maintenance to reduce it. Now that comes with challenges. People, again, especially if you drag out and extend the duration of your turnarounds, you, instead of shutting down every 1 or 2 years, you keep the similar folks. You now go through maybe generational changes as people who were in the last turnaround maybe not around, especially if you're pushing your units 5 to 7 years, depending on the type of unit you have. So it has to go with a strategic approach, as opposed to just a quick, oh, let's just do it because others are doing it. No, you have to think it through. You have to look at the type of crudes. And again, especially now with the issue around crude supply, you may not be as selective on what crudes you run. And there may be challenges imposed with that, with the different metallurgies or different, types of crudes out there that you have to contend with to maintain your reliability.
Right. Makes sense.
A wise man once said that never waste a good crisis. I think it was
Very true.
Winston Churchill or somebody, right? So, do you think this crisis would have a creative effect on would be a creative to the industry, to the plant turnaround industry, in the sense that we are forced to become more efficient, we are forced to improve our ways, to improve our maturity, because yeah, it's a careful balancing act. That's why.
Yeah, it is a very careful balancing act. I think, one of the things is that when, they'll use a crisis or a burning platform type of thing, people will react and think of it as a one of versus necessarily looking and saying, okay, we've made the change now. How can we continue to build on this? We saw that after COVID, a lot of people changed, but then when COVID, diminished, a lot of people fell back into old practices. So it's taking that, and it's an improvement journey, not just a one-time step. And there's always something going on, whether it's this current issue in the Middle East, whether it was the past issues back 5 years, 6 years ago, or low prices back 10 years ago. Remember when price of oil was really low in 2014? The industry is constantly changing, and again, the best ones out there learn from these lessons and continuously apply them and use them. Is there a risk? Potentially, yes. So you just don't go at it blindly. Again, through you using management of change processes to ensure that you've covered all your bases.
Right.
Maybe
I
Pankaj, you can
think,
now take a step back and discuss the
yeah,
discipline in general.
right. So I think, Frank, just touching upon that, right? And the COVID, and now this plus, and I do remember because the prices were kind of going negative, and at that point I was doing maths, and all our pricing models had crashed, saying that, hey, this is the fundamental assumption of pricing anything, right? So I think, like, over years, if you kind of look at how do you think this discipline of turnarounds has kind of changed, because you vaguely touched upon the disciplines, the crew, and the different inputs that go into creating, and I think, Frank, can you touch upon, because people generally think of turnaround, where the processes are not mature, as just execution, right? It's like a 60 or 90-day event.
Mhm.
But in essence, it's like, how at least we think of it is that no single day of a turnaround is actually the same in a 4 to 5 year cycle, right? So how has the discipline changed over the last few decades when it comes to kind of turnarounds, as in general?
Well, so I think turnarounds, and again, when I started in the industry back for over 40 years ago, turnarounds were somewhat of accepted as a necessary evil, and you had to do them, and you did them every 2 to 3 years, depending on the units you were operating. And folks learned that, again, it's not necessarily the individual event cost, it's your total annualized cost, both in maintenance and in turnarounds. It's finding the right balance there. And, the interesting thing is that, um, and I've used this term many a times, is people think that as who are maintenance and reliability professionals, that we're purposes to fix equipment. And it's actually the opposite. Our purpose is to maintain equipment so that it runs all the time, or as much as possible, so it can produce. And so now, how do you find that ability? And with benchmarking and different things like that, we've seen that people have extended their outages, and so they can amortize the cost, maintain a level of reliability, maximize the amount of on-stream work versus turnaround work. Again, there was always this issue, it's safer to do it during a turnaround and it's easier. Plus, it's capital dollars versus expense dollars. And therefore, I don't have to have as much expense dollars, which a lot of people protect. And, the issue is turnarounds got overwhelmed. Now, challenges is, the availability of time, the availability of resources, you just can't execute those massive turnarounds. So now it's finding turnarounds that are at the right size, at the right cost competitiveness, and maintaining the reliability organizations require. And that can be done in a number of different ways. But moving work onto an on-stream aspect, it then, sets the equipment intervals at the equipment's life cycle, not at the turnaround life cycle. So you can actually amortize the cost even longer. And especially nowadays, it's always less expensive, probably a third of the cost of doing work on stream versus during a turnaround. So you can actually end up doing more work, improve your reliability. And, people have figured out that, yes, you can take equipment down or put in isolation capacity capabilities so that you can continue to do this work online and free up and maintain higher margins and reduce your annualized maintenance cost altogether. And the last one here is, again, as I mentioned earlier, is the trick is now, how do you move from an organization that depended on, the collective memory of the site or of the execution people to now, as you've extended the run length, you don't necessarily have the same people. How do you proceduralize that? How do you make it much more disciplined and control it so that you can, still be efficient to execute? In many a times nowadays, a turnaround make or breaks a site's annualized profits. And, versus a necessary evil where it was 20 years ago, it is actually moving towards making a site profitable if you shorten your duration and reduce the amount of cost of it. And so, like everything else, it's finding that right balance.
Right. And frankly, what about the people? How do you kind of see the disciplines? And for example, and you took this example of Formula One, right? Every person has a very, very precise and a designated job, right? How do you think that has kind of evolved along with this when it comes to the
So one of the things that we have to remember, turnaround, a lot of people have just focused on the actual execution. Turnaround takes, generally a larger turnaround takes 2 to 2.5 years to prepare. And the better sites have moved from being, I have a turnaround team that looks after my turnarounds till it's the site basically owns the turnaround. And the site focuses on, meeting the milestones in preparation, getting the work list closed, identifying those projects so that the projects get funded in time and drawings can be issued versus everything scrambling to the last minute. And, if, the better sites focus on maintaining those milestones and keeping on track and taking corrective actions before problems occur. And then allowing, as you get into the last few months, is the phase of, truly getting ready in terms of soak time for people to walk down the field. If your individual in the field is scrambling right to the last minute, then, and that can be a field supervisor, a tradesperson, or engineering technologist. What happens is you lose that resilience, and you had mentioned is no day in the turnaround is the same, and as planned, it always changes. We do know going into any outage is things will change. Things will go bump in the night, and you need to keep a resiliency in your organization to be able to respond to that. So again, do you have the horsepower and the people and technical support to maintain that response to it? And again, getting into it, not only the preparation, but many a times we focus on, do we have the right people? We talk about skilled trades. Well, it's also inspectors, engineers, because in the heat of the battle, especially in a turnaround that could be of 30 to 50 days, your first third is you want to get into the equipment and investigate it, inspect it, identify repairs, and then prepare the repair reports. And to be able to keep to the schedule, you've got to do that fairly quickly. And many a times organizations, well, I've got 2 technicians or 2 engineers or 2 inspectors that, they'll keep up. Well, maybe you need more, because again, you've got a lot of people sitting around waiting for those repair reports, and they become inefficient. And many a times we mislabel where the inefficiency lies. And we have to look at it as an organization, just how you get at it. And we look at the challenge of permitting. If you can't issue permits at the start of ship for everybody, then you inherently build in inefficiencies that reflect in productivity. So you've got to look at it holistically, and the better ones have moved towards that.
Right. So Frank, I think touching upon that topic, right? How do you think and the evolution of technology has kind of happened? Because and I don't know if you agree with this framing, but what I have seen across many organizations is that there are people who are really passionate about turnarounds, that because they really kind of take it very, very seriously, right? Because of all the importance and significance, and it's their bread and butter, right? But when it comes to technology, the technical teams or the technology teams, they have this mindset that this is more of a extension of projects and treat turnarounds as like a stepchild, and then say that, whatever technologies that you have kind of adopted for projects, just use them, right? Because they are not able to kind of differentiate. And I've seen oftentimes the misfit, I don't know if that framing sits with you, or, how have you seen in your experience?
One of the things is that you always have to remember is that, turnarounds are between projects and day-to-day maintenance. And, what you're doing is doing a lot of day-to-day maintenance, that you have a floating schedule and projects have a big floating schedule, which you have, much more of a block of time. And there are capital projects and turnarounds, but there's a lot of maintenance. And to apply the same regimented aspects of capital projects to them is required, but in a much more, and I'm going to use a much more specific, very tight time frame with very quick turnover. And you have to create the organization and the processes to be able to meet the schedule needs. If you have an EPC company, sometimes they get involved in turnarounds and they send out a squad to do the preparation of the repair reports and all the plans and things like that. That's nice, but you don't necessarily have the time frame to spend a week on looking at a valve repair. You need to get somebody, get contractors, get people in there, as I said, get your engineering folks to be able to respond to that level. So it may mean you're putting engineers on nights. You're putting inspectors on nights, because it's a 24-hour cycle, and many a times organizations think that's for the workforce, not necessarily for everybody else. And that's where I was saying is the ones that are doing it really well these days, they view it as a site, and it's all hands on deck. And to meet the schedule, everybody has to do that. It's not just, okay, this is what I can provide you. No, let's figure out how you can meet the schedule needs that we do require.
Got it. Makes sense. And Frank, like from a technology, particularly like the software layer, right? How or what have you seen, like, which can make people really efficient? Either across the turnaround life cycle, right? I think.
So a couple of things that I've seen over the years, and again, when I first started, they were just starting the computerized turnaround planning execution, again with maintenance, and a lot of it was still, I remember seeing the big magnetic boards where they put the job steps on and you move them magnetically on the board, or move them manually on the board. And today now you've got the computerized, you've got the Power BIs and the iPods. Bottom line, the similar principle still stays the same. You have to have good procedures and people who understand those procedures. All the new applications can give you a lot of powerful means of doing things, but if you are not actually designing and utilizing those tools per a set procedure, it can just cause you havoc. And the better ones understand this is how I do it. This is how this software or this tool will end up. Now, one of the things that we don't necessarily have discussed is the fact that there are a lot of new technologies that help you eliminate the need to go into the vessel or into the pipe. External inspection. So again, when you look at risk reduction, is can you obtain the data to give you the necessary measurements you need to maintain that level confidence in your reliability without actually opening up the equipment. And, this is the area where there's been a big change. Online inspections, higher ultrasonic temperature measurements, drones, all these kind of things, scanning technologies that really help do these things online. Two things they help: give you the data to maintain your level of confidence in your reliability, and B, can also help define what those repairs are potentially you need to do either online or during the turnaround. Again, reducing that response time. If you know you're going to have to do it, you plan for it, and then you are ready to execute it accordingly.
Right. No, Frank, that's a great, I think, these innovations, right? And one of the innovations that we are also kind of seeing is where, and this is particularly because we are not seeing the same people in the same turnarounds anymore. They keep rotating, and the tribal knowledge, the tacit knowledge that you earlier talked about, right? How do we actually bring in the learnings which people have kind of maybe put up in like 2000-page learnings reports or inspection reports during the last turnaround? How do we kind of make it accessible to the person who is on the field right now, right? I think that's is also an area where we are seeing that just accessibility of information right when you need it, not so that you have to go and find the needle in the haystack, right? I think that's something that
you bring up a very good point here. And again, one of the things is, we have the traditional post turnaround lessons learned critique, and we put it together and we identify probably 1,000 items, and then we put it on a list. It sits there for the next 3 years until you start your next turnaround planning cycle, and people don't use it. Whereas the better ones, what you do is basically you have a very regimented closeout cycle. And most everybody is familiar with the gate reviews in preparation of a turnaround. Gate 1 is to make sure you're ready to get into it. You're staffed accordingly. Gate 2 is the work list closure and where you're at. And then gate 3 is the readiness. Now you're getting into this gate 4, where it's basically post closeout. And, have you done the lessons learned? Have you actually collected all those things, all those lessons learned, and put them into themes and divided and conquered them in terms of where the decision making needs to be? So if it's a strategic decision and you leave it with your core turnaround team, then nothing's going to happen. This has to go to senior management, because you may look at intervals changes, you may look at different technologies or capital replacements. Plus, the other one is you look at, okay, I just went through this, everything's fresh in my knowledge. Let's make the work list, and they call, some people use the term 80-20. Let's get the first work list out and then identify what are those major capital replacements, what are those, maybe project improvements we need to do, and then start the capital process to work and find those synergies where you can then look at, instead of 2 years out saying, oh, we're at end of life on this piece of equipment, I'm going to replace it in kind. You look at the opportunity where now I can sit there and say, what if I have to replace this? Can I look at maybe improving throughputs, improving cuts? So to take those, and I'm going to use the term direct capital, recapitalizing your facility, is looking at those as opportunities to continue to improve. So some organizations have moved their sites from, say, 100,000 barrels to 110 using those processes. And again, doing that raises your throughput, increases your, the margins you could be making, and then helps basically reduce that capital burden that you are putting on your site.
Great.
And the last one I should add before I goes is, again, because you don't have that tribal knowledge, as you meant, is documenting and filing everything so it's usable, and filing it so that the records are protected. I don't know how many times is, the binders were collected and it sat on somebody's shelf and the binder disappeared 5 years later. Or you had a file, and especially, let's say, your turnaround planning and schedule, you filed it, and then somebody goes in and starts playing around with it and corrupts the file and changes things, versus, okay, as a record, historical record, what did we do? You can copy it and then use it to build your future files, but don't tamper with the historical file.
Right. Now, Frank, I think somehow, at least in whatever short experience that we have had, right, I have seen people really struggle with this, that they don't actually have that knowledge. And I've seen like even like power plants, where the standards are not that great. You did the entire turbine overall, and that report is sitting in someone's desktop, and that person has kind of moved away, right? So I think it's somehow that information, a lot of that information has actually been lost, because 5 years back or 10 years back, people didn't think that, we would have so much of mobilization of people across unit sites, or, how much outsourcing that has happened.
And that's very true. And unfortunately, we used to look at the lessons learned or in closeout as sort of a necessary evil. And you think about it, after an outage, everybody's tired. Everybody, whether you brought contractors, everybody leaves the site, and then you sort of pick it up, and it's an afterthought. To do a proper closeout and maintain that data for future uses, you basically have to start with the end in mind. When you start kicking off your turnaround, you need to start talking about, how am I going to close it out? What is my lessons learned process? And a lessons learned process should never be just at the end of the turnaround. It should be evergreen. And you should be collecting these informations, and especially for larger sites, you may be planning several turnarounds at different phases, and you may find an item that for this event you're planning, maybe it's too late to do something about it. But for the one that's currently in the planning situation, you may apply it right away and get the benefit out of it. So it's constant process, and you do that. But really, it means that every time you start with your event, when you put your premise document together and everything, is start with the end in mind. What do you want at the end, so that you could be successful in the future?
Right. And Frank, I think taking from there, right, I think AI is something that is, again, one of the other disruptions that is kind of happening, with the chat GPTs and Claudes of the world, right? I think, at least to a certain extent, what we are seeing is, it takes effort to organize content, right? It takes the effort to say that, hey, I want my lesson to be captured so that someone in the next turnaround will benefit from it, right? And that takes a certain amount of willpower in the amidst all the chaos, right? Because people are already burnt out. Everyone wants to go for a vacation afterwards, right? So what we are even seeing, Frank, is like people can just record these unstructured contexts. It could be through a audio record or something, just saying snippets key, hey, this was the problem and this was the solution, or this was the safety, this should be carefully kind of taken up in the next TA. And AI can, help you kind of organize and keep all of that organized, so that it's not like random bits, it's like powered with context, right? Which tag number are we talking about? What was the real task? And so on and so forth, right? I'm curious, like, in your experience, like, which pieces of these where we were kind of relying too much on the discipline of the person, which can be kind of, where they can benefit from using technologies like these, because they are spreading themselves too thin. It's just curious to
It is a challenge. And again, the having the disciplined expert who knows that equipment and is able to analyze based on the limited data that you may have, and be able to provide that. Now, some organizations are good. There are a lot of organizations still have those expertise, but they're very conservative, and they don't necessarily take advantage of what they are basically entitled to do. The problem is with everything is, again, if you haven't necessarily gathered the data, and I would challenge also to gather it properly, because you need some sort of structure and some sort of evaluation of what you need to put in, and so just say it looked good versus I was at team in, it's two big differences. And you need to do that. AI, I've seen it applied in niche areas. safety areas, and again, looking at maybe schedule optimization. There have been computer programs and inspection databases that go and look, and through regression analysis and different techniques have been looking at predictability and identifying these things. So it's AI will just naturally be a next evolution, and being able to help in the processing and number crunching, but in the end, we're still not at a point where it can be totally on a wall. What it can do is, and I'll use the term, give helping hands to those experts to be able to find all that information and then make final decisions on it. And again, especially larger organizations where you have multiple sites or multiple, you can then combine and learn from it. But, you know, I've worked for organizations in the past where lessons learned from other sites and inspection results and things like that were then brought forward to a sister site, and then you proactively look for those things where you had problems, or you basically learn that, yeah, we're finding that it's a consistent throughout our units that, yeah, the reliability is maintaining, so we can basically extend the run.
Right. No, I agree with that, Frank. So, Frank, here's a slightly, I think a question that we deeply kind of think about, if you really look at, for example, how your generation learned, how we acquired knowledge, right? And you became an expert. I'm curious, like, what would be your advice? And it's a hypothetical question. So for example, let's say who is joining the industry now, right? Because how you learn is fundamentally kind of changing, right? Because and my father used to work in a steel factory, so I've seen like 40 years in the same plant and how he became, really well versed with literally every single thing, right? But so my question is that in this age of AI and how the discipline is kind of changing, what would be your advice? Let's say if you are that young person, what would you want to say to approach to make a career?
Well, first off, entering the industry, and if you think about it, 10 years ago, oil and gas industry was going to disappear, and nobody wanted to join oil and gas because the future was clean energy. But people forgot that in the oil and gas industry, you build skill sets that are applicable to any industry. And that knowledge can be applied into a lot of areas. So first off, remembering that, the skill sets aren't specifically necessary. If I'm in oil and gas, I got to stay in my career there. There's people who've moved throughout. If you're a project engineer or a project manager or, organizations manager, people have moved on into a lot of other industries. The other one is that the opportunities to see things have now become harder. When I started, I worked on a unit that ran every 2 years for a turnaround, and sure enough, midpoint, once a year, we had an unplanned outage. So in my first part, as I was a maintenance engineer and then a turnaround planner, I went through major turnarounds every year. And so I had the opportunity to see things, go in and do it. So as people are now progressing and you have less of those opportunities, look at those as clear diamonds that in the rough that you can go in and take and expose yourself to and crawl through different vessels, understand it, look at that aspect and appreciate all the different things that you can see. But at the same time, always keep yourself open for new things, new technologies. And again, I always had an open door policy with any vendor that came to my door. And, I said, I don't necessarily have an application now, but this is really interesting new stuff. And a year or two later, I'd phone them in the middle of the night saying, oh, by the way, you mentioned this and you could do it. And the next day they were there and people were going, where did you learn about this? Well, always keep open to new ideas and always listen, because if you think that things don't change, the world is changing around us. So as you're in this new world is, again, the education, the material is all at your fingertips now. Take advantage of it, but go out, take the opportunity to physically see things, because no matter what, that experience and that I'm going to sit there and saying as especially in maintenance, having the understanding and sort of being able to triage equipment and look at how you can repair it, because you don't necessarily have to repair it back to new. You have to make repairs so that it would make the next run or the next interval that you safely can get there, but it doesn't necessarily mean in gold plated. So finding that right balance, and I used to use the term triaging, and to meet the run basis of the next outage or on stream work, and finding that level of practicality and technology and technical experience.
No, absolutely. I think I agree with you, Frank. And I think in our office, when I so when we are a software company, right? So we have new developers, right? And to give them a simple feel of how complicated it is, I think I might find a crack in a glass window, and I say whether to repair it or replace it is $1 million question that people have to learn on the field, right? Just their judgment call.
Yeah.
That's really, I think, what we are talking about.
And I'm being a little bit general here in terms of all people, but especially folks who've gone training through technical schools and things like that. Never dismiss the knowledge of the skilled trades. I mean, I learned my trade from superintendents who were skilled trade people, very smart, but they came through the ranks. They understood a lot of things, and they passed that practical knowledge on to me. So take advantage of that. Don't dismiss it. Learn from it.
Yeah. And I think, Frank, just adding on to that, I think when I kind of visit different clients, right, what like there's a parallel thing that we're trying to kind of somehow bring together is while there is no substitute for going on field and actually learning it and seeing it, there's nothing better and to a large extent nothing beautiful than that. But we're also trying to kind of say that, hey, how can we create a virtual kind of simulator for people to just experience that, right? It could be like, how does even the entire site looks up when the shutdown is happening, exchanges, bundles pulled out and everything, right? So using all the historical records, third-party inspections, images, everything, right? Can we stitch that story to get, kind of give them a simulator kind of experience to even further, bring out like how do you kind of witness the last two turnarounds when you were not here, right? And if you have just kind of joined, right? It could be, how does day one look like? What does day 10 look like, right? So I think that's something, again, that we have been trying to kind of create purely with an interest to kind of, how do we make this attractive for those young people? Because they feel that, we don't get we get like information that is completely kind of scattered and fragmented out there, and we have to basically learn it the very, very hard way, right? I think so we are just trying to basically leverage some of the technology to kind of bring that simulator experience for them.
Yeah, and the one thing that, because everything is driven by time, especially during a turnaround, the new tools allow you to go through and do different scenarios and different optimizations quickly versus it took a lot of time. So there wasn't necessarily a answer. There may be multiple, and then you can understand it, take a look at it, and then help in coming up with the final recommendation or the solution there. And again, very much it's not, one thing I have to advocate is it's not necessarily just an individual, it's a team approach. Because you may understand here that, yeah, this is what I need to affix to the original design of the equipment. But in the meantime, the operating conditions may have changed, or what they want to do, and you can derate or things like that. And there's different ways of going back and solving the problem. But again, it's looking at all parameters.
Right. No, absolutely. And completely kind of agree with that, Frank. And even to that extent, Frank, like when it comes to kind of technology, right? I think, and to the point that you mentioned, right? It's a team effort. Now, even a simple thing like how do we facilitate brainstorming? or challenge sessions by collating data on one screen and letting two teams kind of brainstorm it out. For example, one of the other innovations that we are trying to do is how do you kind of link the plans that are prepared in let's say Primavera to the permitting schedule that operations is trying to manage, right? So it's more about how do you create multiple iterations of the Primavera plan, and how does that link in reality with the permits, and how do you reuse the isolations and the new regulated SIMOPS rules, right? Because they have very, very different visualizations, and different teams kind of interpret things in a very different manner. Planner looks at it in a certain manner versus the permit owner and the area owner will look at it in a certain manner, right? So how do we combine these two sources to kind of let them figure it out? Right. I think those are the places where I think we are seeing like people really appreciate that kind of the
It's very important
output.
because many a times, even when you get multiple groups participating, but if it's not necessarily face to face, and it can be virtual face to face, but many a times people talk past one another as opposed to talk with one another. And it's coming to that common understanding, and also listening to the voice out there who may not necessarily have the expertise, but isn't necessarily bound by some past experience. And, coming up with an idea of, what if we tried this? And many a times I've had people in meetings and they came up and you listened and you said, that's actually quite an elegant solution. And it solved, reducing durations, or it came up with a better repair plan.
Yeah. No, I think that's very, very important, Frank. And I think I was recently kind of talking with a steel plant, and they had this particular thing. They were trying to replace one of the ball mills. And when the time the plant was constructed, there was too much space around to basically bring in a new ball mill, right? But with all the units that have come up, you literally have zero space to actually bring in the new and take this old one out, right? So, and then you have to get into a design engineering problem of how do you even get the new ball mill in and get the old one out without destroying the entire construction that has happened as outside, right? And you'll never find the solutions to those problems ever in any classroom,
No,
so
no,
it's
and what you find is also, when you have, and I've had this happen many times where, capital projects come in and then you want to upgrade something and the vessel is near end of life and you have to repair it. But who's the one who's going to sit there and say, why don't we just replace it?
right.
And the net execution in terms of time, safety, because a lot of the things are fabricated outside, are better controlled, and you're able to do it for a lower cost. But sometimes it's getting people out, step back, and look at the entire picture as opposed to their little siloed segment.
Yeah. And I think, Frank, at least what I'm a deep believer of is that technology can help do that in an accelerated pace. And it's not about telling the answer. I don't think technology is yet, as you kind of pointed, that it will give you the answer, but kind of create these probabilistic scenarios. Like, hey, there are 5 options of with these other potential compromises, right? I think that seeds a lot of content for brainstorming, so that people can arrive and people can kind of participate, right? Because I've very often kind of seen that, people always look up to 1 or 2 people to actually take all that, drive all of that. So I think, so when we think of technology, it's more to create possibilities and let people kind of brainstorm, because, the right answer, as I said, right, like every unit, every turnaround, there is some bit of uniqueness to it. Right. So I think that's at least how we
And I
internally.
think one of the big things that we haven't talked about is 3D modeling and the ability to do simulations, but also the way to communicate what needs to be done, and then helping improve the execution plan, because now it's easier for people to visualize things than necessarily try to conjure up, I'm going to lift this up and I got to pull it over here and what's my obstacles. And again, nowadays, the cost of doing 3D modeling with scanning and all these kind of things has gone down quite a bit. And a lot of people are using it very effectively.
Absolutely. And frankly, that's actually like a very, very elegant and a powerful tool, right? Where um, people just get familiar. And even, for example, how will the crane movement look like? Right. Even planning out those things rather than figuring out on the day on the field is like really an expensive proposition. Right. And so yeah, I completely kind of agree on the simulation aspect of it, which fundamentally kind of changes how things can be done, right? I think those have been my questions. I think Samak, do you have any? But
Yeah, Frank, what's if you have a wish list for people like us who are building for the turnaround industry, you're trying to make STOs better with technology. Do you have a wish list for people like us? This is what I want to see built for the next couple of years.
I think in terms of a wish list, ideally a good turnaround manager would theoretically work himself out of his units having a turnaround. So it's what are those tools out there that can use to help optimize or find the ability to do more work on the run, reduce the overall duration, or be able to break the intervals down, especially in some industries and some units we operate. There are operating windows where it's basically at a reduced rate or shut down for seasonal reasons, so that you can then take advantage of that and not impact the overall operations. And as we talked about, the ability to run different scenarios and do them quickly and be able to help model things so that gives you a chance to look at the different things and go through it versus trying to imagine it. And then second one is, how do you communicate that? And one of the things is, we're still using people to execute all this stuff. We still have to prepare for it long term. And it's getting that team together and integrating that between capital projects, operations, maintenance, technical folks to work as a single team and look at how you can be effective about it, and not necessarily just sit there and prescribe a repair and throw it over the fence and then let somebody else look at it and try to figure it out, versus getting down together and understanding is, okay, we need to do a repair, but what is the end product? What do we want? And what is it required for the next run versus, gold plating, overdoing it? Or can we take the opportunity and actually improve the yields or throughput and take that money we're investing in the company and actually, instead of just replacing kind and recapitalize, take it and put that capital to some throughput improvement that returns yield or investment.
Right. Lastly, where do you see the discipline go from here?
Sorry, Samak, just wanted to add one thing. I think, Frank, to the point around communication, right? I think that itself plays a major role, Frank. And I think some of our experiences have been where, and about how these multiple critical paths, and people generally are obsessed about the first critical path and then the second one, which might have a slack of like 12 hours. So very often we have had these scenarios where in the middle of night, based on the progress, the second critical path became the first critical path, right? And then plant managers, because they have like access to this real-time S curves, they are not really waiting for the evening review meetings to take corrective decisions or remobilize it, whatever the solution could be, right? It depends on the scenario. But just having that information accessible in a real-time information, that itself is kind of fundamentally shaping the decisions, and bringing teams together.
Well, as you stated right at the beginning, once you're in a turnaround, things change, and you have to look at all fronts. And and in critical path and subcritical path, always become a big challenge. As a whole in industry, we tend to focus on those, but we also forget about the critical mass, all that other work there. And many a times we've executed everything really well on the critical path and got that nice big project on time. But then there's a legacy of work that we haven't kept up because we thought, oh, we have flow. So how do you use a tool to give you that insight on all aspects? And, depending on the individual, some people have a natural ability to assess and went through all the reports and look at all those things, how you can speed it up so that a person can see it very quickly. And then, as you had said, be able to go and make some critical decisions to keep everything on track or take those corrective actions early versus letting it build up. And again, you see many a times S curves where things just kept on sliding at work's supposed to go this way, but the plan, the schedule was going the other way, and you create a bow wave and you never catch up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lastly, Frank, where does the discipline go from here?
I think with everything going on, it's a continuous improvement. We have to remember that it's not a one and done. I think one of the key things, and as we had said, is we're stretching our intervals. So every time we go into an outage, it's a new thing for a lot of folks, or they may not have experienced that one. So it's communication up front, adherence to your milestones. Don't let yourself slip. You have to make decisions early and on a reason on the time as you've laid them out, and don't let things slip. And it's an entire holistic organization that needs to work on it. And again, it's hard for a site where you have day-to-day things going on and you sit there, well, that's more important than the turnaround. Not really. It's still a part of the site's responsibility. You just have to figure out how you manage both. And that's where the better sites and the creative sites figure this out and basically be able to do both. I think the other one is there's new tools, new technologies that are coming. How can we then further expand use of those to either extend runs, get the data we need to feel comfortable, or to be able to do it outside of a turnaround? Because turnarounds are costly, they're a safety challenge, and we don't necessarily have the people like we used to with the skilled trades and the technical knowledge to be able to execute such a large amount of work in a short time. So how can we use technology to help us on those things?
Fantastic. Thank you, Frank. You've been very generous with your time and your insights. Thank you, Pankaj. And those watching from home or from your office, keep the faith. The oil industry has survived a lot. We have lived through a lot, and we'll live through this as well. And tune in every 2 weeks to see who we have on the show. And we promise to bring in experts from around the world to weigh in on issues facing the oil industry with a particular focus on maintenance and reliability. Thank you all. Thanks, Pankaj. Thanks, Frank. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the opportunity of speaking with you.
Thank you, Frank. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.